In 1994, after the release of their 8th studio album, Songs of Faith and Devotion, Depeche Mode were a band fractured under the weight of their immense success. Having travelled a long way from their humble roots in the Essex town of Basildon, England, and with a career spanning almost 30 years, it was over the course of 4 albums between 1986 and 1993 that they made their name as one of the most important, influential and successful electronic acts of all time. This film is the story of those 4 records.
I think Depeche Mode created a remarkable balancing act in an individual style, which was to actually make very popular hit music out of some fairly dark themes. And I think that is possibly the key to their enduring success.
For me, it's the combination of classic songwriting and orchestrated with synthesizers in a really serious way.
The longevity of the band, the fact that they still feel fresh, still feel young, is a great counterpoint to, you know, rock acts that have lasted for decades, like U2 or the Rolling Stones or whatever. There's not many people in electronic music have done that and still, you know, done it in a fresh way, and I think we all owe them a debt.
Perhaps it wasn't sort of seen at the outset that they were going to end up that way. Really, 25 years down the line, Depeche Mode are the biggest electronic act the world has ever seen, and probably ever will see.
Depeche Mode was formed in Basildon, Essex in 1980 by neighbours Vince Clarke and Andy Fletcher, along with school friend Martin Gore. Originally known as Composition of Sound, they played local gigs and at the time appeared a much more conventional act to the one that would achieve such great success.
Vince was a guitarist. Martin Gore, in fact, was the only person in the band with a synthesizer. Rumour has it he was asked to join the band because he had a synthesizer. And later on, they obviously realised they needed a visual impact. They didn't really have a frontman. Vince wasn't comfortable in performing that role, although he's quite adept as a songwriter. And they basically found another guy in the area called Dave Gahan, who remains with them to this day as quite an enigmatic frontman. But back in those days, he was quite a dresser. He was sort of known in the area as someone who was into fashion, and basically Dave was drafted in the group. I think as a result of that, they obviously then had a look, at least someone who could bring some visual impact to the group in the early days.
Along with a new visual impact, the group acquired a new name. Taken from the title of a French fashion magazine, Depeche Mode was the name chosen and translates as Fashion Dispatch. Depeche
Mode consisted of 4 band members. They all had their own musical interests. Vince was very influenced by OMD, who'd probably notched their first 2 or 3 hit singles at that time, aware of the early Human League, Kraftwerk as well, so there was the electronic side of things. Dave Gahan was probably more from a kind of rock background, the kind of music he was listening to. Martin Gore also. Fletcher, or Andy Fletcher that is, the sort of silent 4th member of Depeche Mode, he was a heavy metaller. Deep Purple were his thing. So yeah, there's a lot of influences coming in.
The influence of electronic music was most significant for Depeche Mode. The beginning of the 1980s had seen an explosion of new wave acts, many of whom embraced the style and potential of the electronic sound. An offshoot from the new wave was the new romantic movement, who added a more commercially accessible flavour, along with the fashions that were prominent on the club scene. Although the use of electronic instruments and experimentation was not something new. Electronic music had long been on the fringes of the mainstream. Brought to the fore by such acts as Tangerine Dream and Kraftwerk during the early 1970s, the electronic approach provided an alternate route for new groups to the guitar-based sound of the time.
Mid to late 70s, I suppose people like Kraftwerk were beginning to become quite well known by then. David Bowie had done some of his more grandiose, low-type electronic things, so it was moving out of the realms of the prog rock people that had been doing it for a while. Keyboards had been a part of certain classes of music, rock music and that, for quite some time, but it had always been this background thing with guitar getting all the guitarists and vocalists getting all the accolades and the shapes, really. And then with Kraftwerk, it began to become a little bit more. The instrument itself started to become an instrument in its own right, I suppose.
The 1970s was a period of great change in electronic music. The most important thing about the 1970s was that synthesizers, as they were the electronic instruments that musicians could use, started to change from being huge cabinets, and basically you'd need an articulated lorry to move these huge Moog synthesizers into much smaller devices called modular synthesizers, which you could actually pick up and carry in a suitcase.
No longer did you have these great big modular things of 1,000 cables linking with these little boxes together that went in and out and did all that. You had a mini Moog now, and a few other things all beginning to come into one cute little box, and you could just sit there and not really know what you're doing and make these amazing sounds.
But in the early days, synthesizers were very, very primitive, and you could really make one note at a time. And tape recorders were primitive. I had a 2-track tape recorder, so I had to program one sound and then rewind it and program a second sound and ping-pong them together. So it's very laborious, and you couldn't really afford to make mistakes because you could never go back and unravel them later. In a way, that was what made electronic music so interesting in those days, was it was so rarefied. There were only a handful of us doing it, and every time you twiddled a knob, you felt like you were pioneering, breaking new ground.
It was so exciting. It was so exciting to be a part of something which felt genuinely new. I'm not saying that it hadn't come before, because obviously it had. You had your Kraftwerk and people like before, but it felt like it was beginning. It felt like a new generation of young people were beginning to grab it and see the potential.
Amongst the many members of this new generation was a duo from Liverpool who would come to be known as Orchestral Manoeuvres in the Dark. Their involvement with the electronic sound would unwittingly have a profound effect on the eventual direction of Depeche Mode.
Like most teenagers of my generation, I guess, and the ones before and several of the ones after, I was interested in doing something different. I did not wish to repeat what had come before. Just after my 16th birthday, I had heard Autobahn on the radio. That was the catalyst, that was the key. I heard this and I thought, it's catchy, it's attractive, but it's constructed in a completely different way. And I just went, that is what I want to do.
Fahren auf der Autobahn. Wir fahren auf der Autobahn. Wir fahren auf der Autobahn. Wir fahren auf der Autobahn.
The mid-70s just happened to coincide with electronic music becoming, I guess, a little bit more available. Not least for us, was that you could actually buy cheap synthesizers. Our first synthesizer was bought from my mother's mail order catalogue, but at least it gave us access to the instrument.
If you went into a music shop, you could buy a synthesizer and it was an affordable price. It was no longer, an extremely luxurious item to have. It was more comparable to buying a drum kit or a guitar setup. So I think that inspired a lot of younger kids to go out and get into it, and it also made it a lot more practical for the average band to have a keyboard player, and a couple of synthesizers.
Utilising the affordability of the new technology, several bands started to form with electronic music in mind, and although underground, the scene slowly began to build.
The electronic music scene, as far as I was concerned, when I come along, well, there wasn't one really. Not something that I was aware of. I got into it, but I'd say by accident, because I went to a studio to make a punk album and there's a synthesizer there. I'd never even seen a real one before, so I didn't really know that there was a scene as such going on. Then I found out about Ultravox, obviously, and then I found out about Human League, but all in different cities. So it seemed as if there were little groups of people in different cities around the UK that were kind of doing it in isolation.
More and more of the underground electronic bands started to have pop hits and get recognition that way. You had people like the Human League and Soft Cell and so on who had come out of the underground electronic scene, Throbbing Gristle and Cabaret Voltaire and so on, who weren't as successful, but you'd see somebody on Top of the Pops using entirely synthesizers. You'd see Gary Newman up there, using all synthesizers.
Nobody had really done anything, and a lot of us either just got a deal or didn't have a deal at all, and so there wasn't really a movement as such, and so it needed something to kind of bring it all together and to bring it to the public's attention, and I think it was just a matter of time before somebody had the right song or the right opportunity perhaps, and it all came together.
When we got old enough to go into the centre of Liverpool and go clubbing, we went to Eric's Club, which was the focal point of most of the young people in Liverpool for listening to live music. And standing in the audience one night, I think Paul and I heard Warm Leatherette by The Normal come on the house PA, and we just looked at each other and went, shit, somebody in this country is doing what we're doing in your mother's back room, and they've already made a record.
Warm Leatherette. Warm Leatherette. Warm Leatherette. Warm Leatherette. See the breaking glass in the underpass. See the breaking glass in the underpass.
So that really was when we decided we'd better get on stage, and fortunately Eric's had this kind of open door policy, so Paul and I, with our friend's tape recorder, because none of our other mates wanted to go near what we were playing, they thought it was absolute crap. So the two of us and the tape recorder piled on stage in October of '78 to do what we'd been writing for the last 2 years but never dared to do. So we'd heard Warm Leatherette, we go on stage, and we were supporting Joy Division, who of course were about to sign to Factory Records. There was about 30 people in the audience, most of whom actually were our family and friends, and the applause was... I mean, we were going nowhere. This was not the future of popular music. It certainly didn't seem so at the time anyway, but incredibly, there was a couple of people who did seem to think there was something there. We were offered more gigs at Eric's. We were offered to make a record with Factory Records. And obviously Tony Wilson from Factory was actually the first person who heard our music and said, this is the future of popular music. And we were like, fuck off, it's experimental. But it turned out he was right.
The electronic sound did turn out to be the future of popular music, and Tony Wilson of Factory Records was not the only person to see that. Warm Leatherette by The Normal was the brainchild of Daniel Miller, who had launched his new label, Mute Records, to release his own work. The potential seen by him in the electronic style proved to be the perfect grounding for Depeche Mode's eventual success.
We got a deal on Factory. They released Electricity, which I believe then the Depeche Boys heard in a club and went, "Ooh, what's that?" in the same way that we'd done with Warm Leatherette. And I believe they then decided to kind of start playing electronic music. And what did they go and do? They signed to Daniel Miller's label Mute. So the complete circle from Miller through Warm Leatherette to OMD to Electricity and Depeche Mode and back to Daniel Miller was completed.
With a handshake deal from Mute, Depeche Mode was ready to take its first real steps into the public gaze, propelled by the vision of Vince Clarke.
In Vince Clarke, they had an electronics genius. I mean, Vince Clarke totally saw in MIDI a way to make electronic music very, very commercial electronic music without having a lot of equipment around. He knew how to control a lot of synthesizers. The synthesizers were pushed back. You had a few keyboards. Clarke was absolutely crucial to the early success of Depeche Mode.
Vince was still the driving force of the band at that time. He was obviously their principal songwriter. He was the guy going out and getting the gigs. And the early days of the group pretty much were performance orientated. A couple of the band members still had jobs at the time. But perhaps we could say that it was through Vince's tenacity that they eventually found themselves with Mute Records and struck an independent deal, although nothing was actually written, and released their first record just on a sort of handshake agreement at the tail end of 1980. The first single was called Dreaming of Me. It wasn't a particular big hit, but it made the top 50. Not bad going considering Mute at the time. It was a very small independent operation, and we could safely say that nobody could foresee what was going to happen in the not too distant future.
In 1980, Depeche Mode were just a sort of almost like doily light, very nifty, shiny, smart, poppy band. You really didn't imagine that they were going to last the ages. They were going to sell millions upon millions of albums. They looked like they'd be kind of blown away by the kind of next sort of change in the next change in fashion, the next wind of change.
But Depeche Mode weren't blown away. After their second single, New Life, reached number 11 in the UK chart, the band released their third single from their debut album, Speak and Spell, Just Can't Get Enough.
I Just Can't Get Enough is actually an excellent single. It's undoubtedly very, very lightweight. It's very much of its time, and yet it has endured as a kind of a school disco staple, whatever. But it's still very, very listenable and still very much played today. Thematically, it's just about itself. It's just about pop appetite. It's shiny. It's catchy. It's infectious. It's absolutely perfect.
Just Can't Get Enough marked the final release from a successful debut album. However, despite Speak and Spell's warm reception and top 10 positioning, there was to be a major upset as principal songwriter Vince Clarke announced he was leaving the band.
Vince did leave. In fact, he apparently announced he was going to leave before the first album was even released. He went round to each band member and told them. I think they're all quite shocked, although they were committed to their first UK tour on the back of their first 3 hit singles and indeed that first album, Speak and Spell. But apparently Vince just tended to sit at the front of the van on his own, and the other 3 were kind of, enjoying the tour, and it was obvious that he was going.
Really, once Vince Clarke left Depeche Mode, I think anybody looking thought, well, that's the end of them then. He was the songwriter. He was a very good songwriter. He was an ambitious guy who wanted to pursue his other projects, and you really thought, well, it's a bit like Jimi Hendrix leaving the Jimi Hendrix Experience in a sense. How is this band going to survive?
Clarke took his talents and teamed up with singer Alison Moyet to form the band Yazoo, where the sound that he had developed with Depeche Mode continued, albeit on a slightly different tack.
I think there's a lot of parallels musically speaking, that is, between the first Yazoo album, Upstairs at Eric's, which was released within a year of the first Depeche Mode album, Speak and Spell. Obviously Vince wrote most of both albums, and he's using pretty much the same instruments as well, although by the first Yazoo album, he's obviously becoming more adept at using those instruments. But of course, the main difference is this singer that he's now working with, Alison Moyet. This gutsy, bluesy female voice being thrown against these supposed lightweight electronics.
Walked into the door. I turned around with a hurt sound of footsteps on the floor. Yeah, just like addiction. How long have I told you? I need some time to get it right. Your love's been seen through. Please don't you know? I'm never gonna let you go. Don't go. Why, baby, make your mind up. Give me what you got. Fix me with your loving. Shut the door and turn it on. Hey, go get the doctor. Doctor, come too late. Another night I feel all right. My love for you can wait. Yes, don't you know? I'm never gonna let you go. Don't go.
On the face of it, Yazoo appeared a much stronger act musically than perhaps Depeche did with their difficult second album.
Had Vince Clarke persisted with Depeche Mode, I don't think that their career would have had the sort of length and trajectory that it eventually did.
The position of chief songwriter vacated by Clarke was quickly filled by Martin Gore, who immediately set about making the job his own.
Martin already was a songwriter. It's not like he was suddenly said, right, okay guys, who can write songs in the band? We're going to have to do something here. Martin was, a songwriter and had been writing since his teenage years.
Martin created a sound for them which was very distinctive. And if you think about it, for him to take over the reins from Vince, because I mean, effectively Vince was the main man in the first band, and for him to just walk and take his more light pop sound with him, and then Martin had to bring in this other sound, and probably struggled to begin with to find his own sound. But I think Martin brought that more kind of dark, sinister S&M kind of vibe to the whole thing.
The group pressed on with their second album, A Broken Frame. However, soon after completing it, another significant change occurred in the Depeche Mode lineup.
I guess they wanted to do the second album on their own, as a trio, again with Daniel Miller helping them behind the scenes, perhaps to prove that they could do it. They were obviously then due to tour, and they were performing, a lot of records from a lot of tracks rather from the first album, as well as new ones from the second. And I guess they just wanted to continue the arrangements as they were before, so they just needed someone to step into Vince's shoes on stage and play another synthesizer.
After holding lengthy auditions, the group decided upon the 22-year-old keyboard player Alan Wilder. His involvement with the band would ultimately help shape the Depeche Mode sound and contribute in no small way to their eventual success.
Alan Wilder was initially drafted into Depeche Mode purely as a stage musician. He's a classically trained keyboard player. He's also tried his hand at the pop scene as well. He's had a couple of record deals with groups that just didn't make it.
When Alan Wilder joined, I think in 1982, his role, and I think it was his role throughout the time he was with Depeche Mode, was really to colour in the material. In a sense, Martin Gore was a songwriter. He's almost like a content provider as opposed to a sort of stylist or whatever. And I think that it's Alan Wilder would have been the one that really helped realise the tracks. He was the one that was working with the various producers. And though he's not exactly the composer, it's obviously played a very important role indeed.
With the release of A Broken Frame, Depeche Mode proved that despite Vince Clarke's departure, not only could they survive, but were taking their music into an increasingly more serious and darker sound, partly inspired by Daniel Miller's involvement with some of the industrial acts coming from Germany.
Their first single of 1983, in other words, the first single that didn't come off the second album, Get the Balance Right, sort of just outside the top 10 in early 1983. It was the first record that Alan Wilder was actually directly involved in. And it's a bit more downbeat in terms of sound and mood than the previous releases had been. So I think also he is going to have some impact in the way that the sound develops. in tandem with these influences coming over from Germany, the industrial scene, and also new technology that was just starting to arrive at that time as well. We're talking about the early days of sampling here. So we're making a distinction between synthesizers and samplers, which allow you to manipulate recordings of sounds, which of course is what a lot of these German industrial bands had been hammering away with bits of metal on stage and all that kind of thing. Well, I guess Depeche sort of then started thinking about incorporating elements of that kind of thing, but in the pop formula.
It was clear that they were definitely trying to, get dark and toughen their sound up, get darker, whatever. I mean, we all took it very seriously. They wanted to change their sound, but it was the start of bringing distortions in. I was very interested in room sounds, so I was very keen to move away from DI synthesizers, and all the synths went through amps as well, basically. And this gave a whole new edge and an excitement for them and for me to the work that we were doing, because it's not something that they'd really done before. Before, synthesizers had been recorded, there was a plug on the back, you plugged it in the mixing desk, and you got this fantastic sound that came out of the mixing desk, more the sound of Violator maybe than the sound of Songs of Faith and Devotion. But back in the days of construction time, yeah, we were starting to do that, and everything was getting thrown into amps, so there was always a distorted edge, and we had a close mic on the amp and a mic down the other end of the room, so it was kind of ambient, so there was an ambient sound as well.
The handshake seals the contract. From the contract, there's no turning back. The turning point of a career, in Korea, being insincere. The holiday was fun packed. The contract still intact. Grabbing hands, grab all they can, all for themselves. After all, the grabbing hands, grab all they can, all for themselves. After all, it's a competitive world. Everything counts in large amounts.
It was a very natural kind of fusion of ideas. Somehow there was a shared vision, whereas now, of course, we would all meet and probably discuss what we wanted to do. Then we kind of just met in the studio and started recording, but somehow it clicked.
Depeche Mode's change in sound reflected the continuing development of electronic music within the 1980s. Still battling against the expectations of the old guard of music that based their sounds in live instruments, acts that predominantly utilized synthesizers and sampling were constantly looking for new ways to break through into the mainstream.
During the course of the 80s, I think electronic music evolved quite quickly, even within the context of pop music. And you had different threads going on. Synthesizers were very unhip at the beginning of the 80s in the sort of harder rocking scene, and certainly in the dance scene. There'd been a very strong reaction to disco, and disco, if you remember at the end, you had Donna Summer and Giorgio Moroder using synthesizers and those sort of octave bass lines and electronic snare drums and things in dance music, and that was very, very unhip for much of the 90s, for much of the 80s, until the point actually when New Order did Blue Monday and that era of their stuff, because up to that point they'd been viewed as a sort of indie guitar band, and suddenly they went all the way back to those Donna Summer bass lines and Roland SH-101 synthesizers and things like that.
Does it feel when you treat me like you do? And you laid your hands upon me and told me you are.
I was actually very surprised at the time that a band that was sort of, you know, an NME favourite would actually be as unhip as to start playing synthesizers. So I think it sort of echoed a movement within the electronic music scene more over to the dark side. And that sort of cheerful, hoppity kind of quirkiness of just can't get enough, you know, started to give way to the darker stuff that Depeche were starting to do. It was a radical change really to their sound, and I think it was very risky and actually very daring on their part, because they were running the risk of you know, blowing off their core audience.
Yeah, when you've become successful and then you take a bit of a detour with the music, you do risk losing everything. And you know, however big you are, there's always dozens, hundreds, thousands even, people just waiting around the corner, and record companies keen to push their next pet project. And it's a very, very easy thing to let slip. And making the wrong album at the wrong time is a sure way of doing that.
The industrial sounds combined with growing political themes in Gore's songwriting on Construction Time Again seemed the perfect antidote to the lighter, happier sound of Depeche Mode only 3 years earlier. The band themselves appeared to be carving out a niche within music.
I can't really think of anybody else at that time who were spending as much time meticulously working on sound, or diligently working on sound as they were. I mean, Kraftwerk in Germany by that point had kind of retracted into their own infamous Kling Klang recording studio and had yet to follow up on their last breakthrough album, which was about 3 or 4 years earlier, an album called Computer World. So, you know, perhaps they would be diligently working on sounds, but nobody was hearing them.
Construction Time Again was the first step in a new direction for the band and was a moderate success both critically and commercially. Depeche Mode had managed to shift their sound and image without driving away their core following, and the band continued in this vein, moving into their fourth album, 1984's Some Great Reward. This not only achieved similar success to its predecessor, but also spawned the hit song People Are People, which surprisingly also provided the band with their first success in the United States.
Depeche Mode's biggest hit single since the very early singles, like Just Can't Get Enough. I think the next time they really broached the top 10, nearly went all the way, was People Are People in 1984, their first single off their fourth album. And that's got an amazing array of sounds on it. It's incredible. They spent a long time working on these sounds. I mean, everything was sampled, right the way down to the bass drum of the record. It wasn't just a bass drum off a drum machine. It was a sort of bit of metal being hit to get the percussive edge, and then added to something else, and something else combined to produce. And that's just to produce the bass drum.
We were constantly trying to push boundaries. Very much everyone, actually, in the team. For me, I mean, because I worked closely with them on those 3 albums, like Some Great Reward being in the middle feels like a transition from the one to the other, from Construction Time, which was completely a new experience for me personally, because I'd never worked with the band before, to Black Celebration, where we all felt we'd really achieved something unusual and dark and interesting. And in a way, even though Some Great Reward had, People Are People on it, and Master and Servants on it as well. There were 2 big hits. It somehow, for me personally, still feels like a bit like a transition object between the other 2 records.
Around about 84, a very interesting thing happens. America Which really, in theory, would be very hard for a band, or impossible for a band like Depeche Mode to break America, because the American music scene and the left and the right has this, it's hung up on ideas about authenticity and realness, and this usually means guitars and tradition and unstylish men in tight white t-shirts or whatever, the Springsteen stereotype. Or, then there are also things like the disco sucks movement, there's a kind of visceral loathing of all things electronic, as representing effeminacy and inauthenticity. And then overcome Depeche Mode, along with a few other bands. There's Unlikely British Invasion, and there's even people like a flock of seagulls who, for some reason, gained traction in America, of all places. So I suppose it wasn't just Depeche Mode at that point, but that was the sort of point at which they do get this first rather unlikely foothold.
The success of People Are People in the United States provided the band with a good foundation on which they strongly intended to build upon. The change in the band's style and sound, along with the influence of Daniel Miller and the addition of Alan Wilder to the group, had built steadily, and now the band were ready for a new album, the first in a meteoric 4-album rise to the top.
They'd released an album every year, from 1981, 1982, 1983, 1984, and then 1985 they didn't actually record an album. I think it was a period of sort of, stepping back a little bit and what do we do next? And as it was, they did come out with a 5th album 6 years down the line in Black Celebration, which really was a continuation of what they began with Some Great Reward. It still was a very sort of industrial sounding album.
Black Celebration came out in 1986, and by that point, certainly in terms of the whole world of synth-pop, things have reached a rather interesting point. By this point, that's the same year that Kraftwerk released Electric Cafe, which was effectively their last album. Their work was done by then. They kind of sort of laid down the entire sort of grid. And by this point, you've got groups like New Order, Eurythmics, the Pet Shop Boys. So synthpop is no longer this kind of slightly kind of quirky, faddish option the way it was a few years earlier. It's now pretty much the element. And so Depeche Mode were very much at that point, they were in their element.
They'd gone back to Berlin with the same team as before, Daniel Miller, Gareth Jones, and they'd recorded at Hansa recording studios. But they'd really kind of, the idea this time was that they were going to sort of live and work together, as it were, continuously.
Daniel Miller, the record company boss and co-producer of the album, had a vision to live the album, he described it as. He said, right, I propose that we live the album, which means we're going to meet every day from the start of the album recording until it's finished, and we're not going to do anything else. And everyone thought, oh, that's a good idea, let's do that. He didn't lay the... It was a strong suggestion from him. He was like, what do you think of that? And everyone went, okay, that sounds about right, because we were all pretty focused and hyper and wanted to really do it, And so that's what we did. So that made it very intense. And it had enormous influence on the claustrophobic nature of the achievement.
They apparently only had a day off between flying in and then recording, and it became a very drawn out and quite torturous experience by all counts. I think the team that had sort of developed over the albums 3 and 4 and was being continued into this 5th album, they're probably starting to rely on old formulas a little bit. Not necessarily repeating themselves, but certainly the equipment and the whole sampling everything, and having a sort of unwritten rule that no one sound will be the same from track to track and album to album. It was clear that this was going to become impossible to continue forever.
When we finally decided, right, we've got to mix this album now, otherwise it's never going to be finished, we started mixing it, and Daniel and I got involved with the title track, actually, and we're continually dissatisfied, which to me now these days is not such a big deal. I throw up a mix, I don't like it, I save it, I put it away, I come back to it another day and do something else in the meantime. This was obviously in a big console and a big mix, so we put a mix up and spent all day putting a mix up, and then we'd listen to it and we'd think, no, that's not it, it's not right, and then we'd pull it all down again, and then we go, okay, the next day we come in again, because we didn't think, okay, we'll just do something else. That would have seemed like a diversion. No, we had to get this one right, I think it was Alan came in and the band had a serious meeting about it, and Alan came in and said, look, this has got to stop. We cannot go on like this. It's driving us nuts. We need to commit. We've got to get these mixes down. We need to move forward. And he had a real serious, grown-up talk with us about moving forward and committing and getting shit done, you know.
We could say that Black Celebration was a difficult album. Still produced some hit singles, most notably Stripped, which again, a bit like People Are People, to listen to even today, you know, contains an amazing array of sounds. I mean, just even in the opening 30 seconds we listened to, you know, a motorbike engine sort of turning over very slowly in a rhythmical way, and then you hear a car engine start up before you get a sort of ominous drone, and then, you know, the song sort of starts. You know, even in that first 30 seconds, you can imagine it would have taken ages to put that kind of thing together.
The motorbike and the Porsche engine starting up and everything, it's all like you know, Dave's car and whoever's, I can't remember who the bike belonged to, but it was all piece. I had kind of the fact that the throbbing motor runs all the way through it underneath gave it a real industrial grounding in a kind of a really literal way. The basic rhythm of the track is inspired by the throbbing of the engine, which is an internal combustion engine slowed down. We all wanted to be taken very seriously. We didn't want to be thought of as kind of a throwaway pop band. And when we did Stripped, we were all very pleased with the dark nature of it.
Stripped is perhaps a classic example of Depeche Mode trying to be as un-Depeche Mode-like as possible, and that perhaps been the key to their success. He's got some very strange lines, you know, stripped down to the bone. Is rather an odd idea, almost like slightly beyond sort of sexual. And then there's this feeling that you'd expect Depeche Mode to be kind of pro the city, pro the metropolis or whatever. But it's almost Pol Pot-like, you know, take them by the hand and go back to the land. It's almost like some sort of agrarian type proposition, and that's where you can only really be truly free. And it's wonderfully. It just shows there isn't this kind of sort of simplistic, futuristic thing going on with Depeche Mode, that the ideas that Martin Gore is dealing in are actually quite complex, slightly morbid, and quite revealing in that sense at times.
Released on February the 10th, 1986, Stripped marked Depeche Mode's 6th consecutive single in the UK Top 20, peaking at number 15. Their success, however, appeared limited due to the more uncommercial nature of their music.
By this point, it had become clear that Depeche Mode have got a very strong, hardcore fan base, albeit quite a large fan base. But certainly in the UK, they're no longer having the crossover hit singles, you know, of yesteryear. I mean, just can't get enough. Obviously, there was a lot of people buying that record. I forget, it's something like 500,000 copies sold. And, you know, that's above and beyond the Depeche Mode fan base of the time. It's people who like Depeche Mode buying it, and housewives who like a catchy, whistleable song buying it as well, let's say. But by 1986, when these darker, moodier tracks are starting to come out, like Strip, which actually sound very unusual as well, certainly don't sound like your average pop sort of ditty of the day, it really appears to be only the Depeche Mode hardcore fan base that are buying these singles.
It's a tricky thing to get right, and it's a tricky thing to bring the audience with you when you do that, because a lot of them, if not the majority, will want you to stay doing what you do. You know, and every time you do a little detour, they'll go, it's not as good as what you did. Yeah. Why don't you go back and do that again? And you get into all that sort of stuff. So to be able to do that and just keep getting bigger, again, brilliant.
It certainly doesn't feel in any way, you know, pop-opportunistic, if you can, or in a particular word. And it doesn't seem to be. Again, you know, there's perhaps, you know, coming from the whole mute culture. You know, they're not being lent on to sort of produce another hit in the certainly not in the sort of Vince Clarke type vein. And so yes, they do suddenly seem a slightly more kind of serious proposition. They're dealing in themes and ideas, rather than possible hit singles. It's certainly dealing in slightly kind of unusual and rather personal themes and ideas, very much to do with negotiations in love and romance, a slightly kind of existential take on it, and coming up with some surprising conclusions, finding a lot of solace in material things, rather than some sort of immaterial, sort of conventional pop ideal.
On the album side of things, however, they're still selling very, very well. I mean, every single album from the very first Speak or Spell to the fifth, now we're in 1986, Black Celebration, they all go straight into the top 10. So we can sort of say that the Depeche Mode fan base in the UK has hit a certain sort of size, and they're starting to veer towards being an album act, not so reliant on having hit singles to carry the albums into the top 10 anymore. And by this stage, the next tour that they undertake on the back of the Black Celebration album, things are really starting to change as well. They're playing larger venues.
Following Stripped, Black Celebration debuted in March of the same year. It had continued the dark and somewhat industrial nature that Depeche Mode had embarked upon with Construction Time Again and Some Great Reward. The resulting promotional tour saw the band play to sell-out crowds in the UK and Europe, and once again they set their sights on breaking the United States.
The tour into the US on the back of Black Celebration again. I mean, again, Black Celebration, it wasn't really a major hit album in the US. I think it got into the top 100, something like that, as did the previous album. But the sort of, the Depeche Mode interest, if you like, the wave of the undercurrent, it seems to be growing somehow. And live, again in the US, they're starting to, in certain territories, not everywhere, they're getting to the sort of stadium level as well. Chicago, LA, they're starting to play to 10, 15,000 people at a time on that tour as well. So it's clear that their diligence in going back to the US repeatedly is now starting to pay off. By 1986, Duran Duran, for example, who were a very big band in the United States, starting to taper off and go the other way with a more traditional sound. Even they're struggling to sell out the 10, 15,000 seat arenas that Depeche Mode are now starting to fill. But of course, by the time that A Question of Time is released as the third single, Depeche Mode are already on this world tour on the back of the album, which, as we said earlier, is starting to make breakthroughs in the US as well. The Depeche Mode had always been derided for their look, really. By this point, they were dressing in sort of black. This whole idea of a black celebration, celebrating the dark side of life, really is kind of the gist of that album. So, they were